Angular and ngrx. And in this lesson, we're going to focus about the ngrx store data flow. When you're working with Angular and ngrx, you have a certain flow of data from the ngrx store to your Angular components. And the Angular components might change the state of your ngrx that the ngrx store is now holding. So there is a flow of information of data from the store to your components, and from your components changing the state in the store. And as usual, you have the entire lesson, the guide, step by step, including the source codes in our site, academies.com, EN course, Angular, ngrx store data flow. And in the site, you have a full article with a step by step, including source code example and a source code. Everything is open source and free. And in today's lesson, we're going to focus on the data flow diagram of an ngrx store, an Angular application, about the diagram of data flow between the store and your Angular components. And there is a similar diagram in the ngrx documentation. It looks something like this. What we are doing in this lesson, we are simplifying this diagram, focusing only on the store, the reducer, the action, and our Angular components. The rest, we are going to focus on future lessons. Think about it like this. We're not going to talk about the entire car, this entire diagram. Rather, we're going to focus on the engine of the car and understand the engine very clearly, and then build on top of that, understand what are selectors and effects and ngrx data and so on. But in this lesson, we're going to focus on the data flow of the store, reducer, action, and component. And what we have in our diagram, the store is holding the state, the current state, and it's passing the state to our Angular components. Our Angular components is going to render based on the state that the ngrx store is holding. And our Angular components might have an event, for example, a button click. And then the button click might issue a change in the state using store.dispatch. The store.dispatch gets an action, and then based on that action in the current state, a reducer decides what is the new state. So this is the data flow that we're going to focus on in this lesson, including code example of each step of this data flow diagram. Now the point of this lesson is not to focus on the API. I'm not going to generate actions according to the proper API that you should be using. Rather, we're going to have a lesson about action. Same with reducer. We're not going to create reducer with the proper ngrx API. We're going to focus on the data flow. We're going to try to transfer data from the store to our Angular components and change that data from our Angular components back to the store. And while doing so, understand each step of the data flow in our ngrx Angular application. We're going to try to simplify the ngrx data flow with code. So during this lesson, we'll write code to try to simplify and make you understand how the ngrx store data flow is working. So to do this, we'll start a new Angular application. So in your terminal, type npx angular CLI. Let's take the latest and type new and name our app ngrx data flow. I'm also going to pass the flag minimal to create minimal amount of files. No external templates, no external styles. And we're not going to focus on styling, so let's choose CSS. I don't want to enable server-side rendering. This is a new feature of Angular 17. It is now asking us if we want to add server-side rendering and static site generation. We'll answer no, and we'll wait for a project to be created. Great, our app is now created. Let's cd into the generated folder. And in this folder, if we'll take a look at the package JSON, we'll see that Angular is now installed in version 17. Angular version 17 was released a few days ago. So now what we're going to do is we're going to install ngrx store and ngrx store devtools. So let's go back to the terminal, and in the folder that was created with Angular CLI, let's type npx ng add ngrx store. Now this is the weird part. I'm going to pass the next. The next is the beta version. This is usually you'll write the latest, not the next, but since Angular 17 is new, so I need to use the beta version of ngrx packages, so that's the next flag. Those are the packages that support Angular 17. So I have to pass the next flag. And the package will be installed. Do I want to proceed? Yes. And I'm also going to install the store.devtools. So ng add store.devtools. This will make our app easier to debug since we can work with the Redux Chrome extension, Redux DevTools extension. Do I want to install it? Yes. These are the basic installations we need. We can now work with Angular and ngrx, and we can now inspect the general data flow that we talked about in the diagram: the store, the components, the actions, and the reducers. Our next state is to populate the store with some data. We will begin examining the diagram that we talked about the ngrx data flow from the bottom store. The store is holding our state. So let's populate the store with some data. So we're going to open the project that we just created with Angular CLI. We're going to open it with VS Code, and we're going to populate this state. We're just going to put in the state a counter with a value of a number. So let's go back to our code, and let's open the source. In the app, let's create a state file where we're going to describe that our state looks like a counter, has a counter with a number. This is how our state looks like. So let's populate our state with a counter of some numeric value. So let's go back to the app config, or if you're not in Angular 17, you probably have app module. In here we'll have the provider store, and in here we can place, say that we have a counter with a value, and let's place a value of, let's say, number 42. Again, the code is not that important. The exact syntax is not that important. The API is not that important. What's important here is to understand the general data flow. And what we're doing now is we're taking the store and we're populating the state with a counter equals to 42. If we open our browser, sorry, we'll go back to the code, type ngserve, go back to the browser, open the developer tools, open the Redux tab. We'll reload the app on 400, localhost 4200, and we should see Redux tab. Let's close the developer tools and reopen the developer tools. Here's the Redux tab, and we populated the counter with a value of 42. So going back to our diagram, we saw that we took the store and we placed the state. And the state in the store, we placed the state with a counter key and a value of 42. So we populated our store with state, with data. And it doesn't really matter the API we used. Usually you use a different API to initiate the state in the store. Usually you use reducers to initialize the state. But in our case, it doesn't really matter the API or how you will do it. We will focus on the right way to do it, best practices, and API in future lessons. In this lesson, all we care about is to understand the objective of the store, the objective of the actions, and the objective of the reducer. The right practice, the API, we'll learn in future lessons. So all I cared about was actually populating the store with state so you can understand what the store job is. The store job is to hold the state. So we populated the store with the state. Now I can read that state in my Angular components. And this is what we'll focus on now. We'll try to read the state. We placed a counter value in our state. Let's try to read it. And once you have your state with data, you can read that state from the store. So if I install ngrx store, I get the store service, which I can now inject to my component. The store service, there is only one instance of that store service, and I can use that store service to read the state. So you can also, this is the main things you will do with the store. You will either read the state or you will start a transition, a process of changing the state. So once we installed ngrx store with ng-add, we can inject the store to our Angular components. In this example, we have an Angular component and we're requesting the store service in the constructor. So if I go back to the code, I can open the app component, and now I can ask my component, the Angular dependency injection, to provide me with the store service. All I need to do is import from ngrx store, and I'll import the store service, and I'll place a constructor in my component. And I can also place a generic type that mentioned that the store contains a component of type state. We need to import our state. Our state is located in the, let's import type from our state file. I don't think I exported the state, so let's add in the state file, I'll export the state. So now my store holds state, and I can place a generic type which signifies, which helps me using TypeScript to identify what kind of state type does the store holds. So this is now me injecting the store, and using this store service, I can read the state, or I can start a change transition of the state. So now that I have the store service, I can use the store select to read data from the state. So usually we'll talk about best practices to read the state. We'll talk about selectors, which improves performance when you select the state. I'll also place a link to injectable functions, which you can also use along with selectors to select the state and have a reusable functions to select portion of your state. But we're not going to focus on selectors in this. I'll place the link in the description. You can get the data once you select the data from the store. You get the data as observable. If you get the data as observable, it means that usually on ngrx application, it's really easy that your entire componentry will be made from components with a strategy, change detection strategy of on push. All the data you get from as observable, and you can use the async pipe to read the data. So it's really easy to use the on push. Let's try to read this data, read the counter that we have in our state. So let's go back to our code. And now I'll go to my component. Let's start with changing the change detection to change detection strategy on push. Now I'll place also a link in the description of best practice that all your components can be in on push. You can also set Angular CLI to create components in on push. You can also enforce it with a lint rule. I'll place a link with a lesson about best practice to change all your components to on push. So I'll change my components to on push, and now I can also read the data. So let's add here, instead of title, I will take and delete the title and place a counter dollar and take the store service and call the select. Now the select will get a function inside, and the function will get the entire state, which is of type state, and from this I can select the state.counter. Now I selected the counter, and remember this is an observable, so I can read it by using the async pipe. Now, just to mention again, we're not focusing on API, so usually you place a selector inside the select, and usually you can wrap all this thing with injectable function and use injectable function instead of dependency inject the store, but I'll place a link to that video as well. But we're not focusing, we're just focusing on the objective of the store, which is to hold the state, and now my components can read the state. So if we go back to the browser, we see that we read the state, and 42 is displayed. So we managed to read the state from the store. Now that we understand the store job to hold the state and how we read the state, let's talk about how we change the state. Now, changing the state is starting with some sort of event. We'll talk about the type of events that might happen that will trigger a state change. So let's say in this diagram, an example, the user clicked a button on a click event, and after the click event, you grab the store service and you can call in the click event a store method called dispatch. And the store dispatch is the only way to change the state. It will start a change state process. So after you call the store dispatch, you pass an action to that store dispatch. An action in our case, we'll just regard it as a simple object with an identifier, which is the type, which identifies the action. Every action has a unique identifier, as well as optional payload. Some events, something that might trigger a state change need to pass along additional information. For example, let's say the button click might pass along a string to send, or a new counter to set, or a server response might send the service response as the payload. So additional event might have additional data which is stored in the payload. The action is then passed to a reducer, which decides how to create the new state. A reducer gets the current state and the action, and it will decide what the new state is. So this is the flow of changing the state, which is a bit more complicated than reading the state. So it starts with an event, a store dispatch, an action passed to the reducer, and then the reducer decide on the new state. So let's start with the event. Certain events might happen that will cause you to say, hey, I want to change the state. This event should cause a state change. So for example, in the diagram, the button click. So popular things that can cause a state to change is, for example, user actions like clicking a button, mouse over, or whatnot. So user action, server request or response. Often you get a response back and you want to change the state with information that you got from that response. You might get a timer event. You might set a set timeout or a set interval, and then periodically change a state after some kind of time interval. You might do state change when you do routing. So for example, your user is moving from one screen to another. You might change the state due to that route transition. You might change it. We'll talk about a library called ngrx effects in future lessons on ngrx, and the effects also often trigger state change from previous action. So previous actions that happen that you store dispatch in action might cause another action to start. And this is often, we use ngrx effects to create those side effects that often caused from actions or from routing or from different other sources. You might create a side effect that changes the store, but more on the effects on in future lesson. And so in this case, we're going to do a button click that we'll call the store dispatch when the user clicks a button. So let's call the store dispatch. The store dispatch is starting a change process. So we pass an action to the store dispatch, and an action describes the description of what happened. So let's try to add a button click and then call the store dispatch. So let's go back to our code, and I'll add a button to my code. And let's say the text will be click me, and it will trigger event of click, and it will call, the click event will call, let's say, increment function. And let's create the increment function. And in this function, what I'll do, I'll take the store and I'll call the dispatch function. And the dispatch function means that I want to start a change process of the state. In the dispatch, I need to pass an action. An action in our case is a description of what is happening, and this is an object with type and a payload. So let's pass in the dispatch, we'll pass an object with a type, let's say call it increment, just a string, a unique string, and no payload is needed. Let's say, okay, let's say payload of the new counter, let's say 38. Okay, so I'm passing a payload of the new counter. A payload is additional data. It can be changed from one event to another. Now, when you do a store dispatch, the reducer will get that information. So we call the store dispatch with some action. We are starting a change process. So let's talk about the action that we passed. An action is description of the event that happened. Action contains a unique identifier, which is the type that we placed here. Also, action gets a payload, optional payload, if you want to pass additional information with your action. And now we created a store dispatch and we passed an action. In our case, our payload just contains a number. In this case, the action payload contains an array of strings. Basically, the payload can be any additional information that you need to pass in order to change to the new state. From here, the action will get to the reducer. A reducer is a simple function which decides on the new state. So let's talk about the reducer. The reducer is a simple function which is getting the current state and the action that happens, and that reducer needs to decide what is the new state. We'll have a full lesson about how to create reducer, what is the correct API and best practices. For now, we will just create a simple reducer as a function. So let's go back to our code, and in our app, let's create a reducer file. A reducer is a simple function. That function is getting the state, the current state, and the action, and this reducer needs to return the new state. So I can do something, and again, it's not how you do it, it's not how you create a reducer, but I can say if my action dot type equals increment, then I want to return the action dot payload. Else, I'm going to return 42. Now that, let's say the state is of type mystate, and the action is of type, let's say, ngrx store action. Do I have action with payload? to remember, because usually you don't create the action like this. Let's keep it as any. We're not going to focus on the type here. Again, best practices of action we'll have in a future lesson. So if the action type is increment, I'm going to return the action payload. This will be the new state. My new state is set to the payload of the action. If I don't have an action type increment, I will just return 42. Now, I need to register every reducer that I create. I need to register in my store. So the way I do it, I go to where I provided the provide store, and in here basically what I placed is a reducer. So instead of this hard-coded reducer, I can place my reducer function. Okay, now let's see that our code is working. So let's go back to our code, and in here I have click me, and when I click me, it turns to 38. Now let's go back to the debugger to understand the step that happened, the flow, the data flow that happened when we click the button. How do we change the state? What is the flow that is happening? Let's go back to the app component, and let's go back to the increment function. Once I click the click me, it takes the store service, it calls the dispatch, and it's passing an action to the dispatch. From the dispatch action, it goes to my reducer. The reducer will get the current state, which is 42, what I see on the screen, and the action that happens, which is the payload and type. The action type is increment, so I enter the if, and I return the new state, which is the payload. It's 38. And now the state is changing. You can also see in the Redux DevTools the steps that happened. On the left, you see the actions that happened, and on the right, you have the state. So once I click the click me, let's remove the breakpoint. Once I click the click me, I see that, let's see this again without the breakpoint. So once I click the click me, I see a new action was added. Increment is the name of the action, and I see the counter is changed. I can also time travel back and see the previous result. So we saw how we change the state using action and reducer. So just to summarize the data flow of ngrx, this is a simplified explanation of the flow of data in ngrx. We do not focus on API. We focus only on the objectives of the store, action, and reducer, and not focusing on the correct way to create them, just for you to understand how the data flow in ngrx is working. So this was a simplified example of ngrx data flow. The store is holding the current state. Component can dependency inject the store service. This is a single service that we have, a single instance of a service, a singleton, to read the state. And I can also, when I inject the store service, I can also call the store dispatch to change the state. I pass the store dispatch an action, which is a description of the thing, how I want to change the state, the description of the action that happened that will start a change state process. The action describes the event that happened and additional payload. We then register a reducer to our state, and the reducer is getting the action and decides how to change to the new state. That's it. That's the general data flow of ngrx. From here, we'll start to focus on the right API of the action and reducer, and we'll also follow it with student exercise, how to create action. You'll have an exercise how to properly create action, how to properly create reducer. So thank you for listening, and let's jump on to the next lesson.